Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis for the Diversity and Spirituality Network podcast. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, the Diversity Spirituality Network is an emerging community of people that are actively exploring the integration of diversity and spirituality. You can find more information about us by going to our website, diversityandspirituality.com. And if you like the podcast, I'd like to encourage you to rate it on iTunes or wherever you get podcasts, which helps us spread the word. So today, it's my privilege to interview Fiona Robertson. And Fiona is the author of a recently published book called The Dark Night of the Soul, A Journey from Absence to Presence. Fiona is also a facilitator and teacher of living inquiries, which is an embodied inquiry process that she co-created. And she facilitates this process, people all over the world, from her home in Nottingham in the UK. Fiona, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Angelo. It's lovely to be here.
You know, we're going to talk about your book, but I thought a good way to start it would be giving like a definition of what others have talked about is the meaning of the dark night of the soul, which you're probably familiar with. It comes from a poem that was written by a 16th century Spanish mystic and poet, St. John of the Cross. And is a description that I thought was useful. It says, the dark night of the soul does not refer to the difficulties of life in general, although the phrase has been understandably taken to refer to that. The nights which the soul experiences are two necessary purgations on the path to divine union. So I thought that was interesting in my research. So I understand from reading your book, Fiona, that you yourself have experienced the dark night of the soul. So I wonder if you could tell me what that was about.
Yeah, great question. So in brief, I'd say that my dark night of the soul began just at the point where I felt like I'd really got myself together. I'd become the person that I imagined I wanted to be. And, you know, we all have that sense of the ego ideal within us. I'd basically arrived at that point and spent a few months thinking, great, now I've made it. I've become the person I want to be, for it all to crash and fall apart around me. Because fundamentally, that's not who I was. So it was a coming back into who I really am, a discovery or a rediscovery of who I really am behind the mask, you know, behind the character or the personality that I'd become, as we all do, in response to what we grow up with and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And as part of that, it was coming into everything that I'd avoided or distracted myself from or denied within myself, you know, that shadow part of myself.
And this wasn't a month-long thing. It took quite a number of years to really to go through the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say the most intense part of it was about 4 years, which is not uncommon.
Yeah, I was just reading one of the there was some mystic saint that it lasted 45 years, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
So it can be quite a long time. Now, you mentioned that there were things that you were avoiding. So that makes me think that there were some signposts or some signs that you might have seen that if you had seen them, you wouldn't have had to go through this. Is that correct? And give me a sense as to what that was about.
That's a really interesting question. There were certainly signs that I could recognize in retrospect.
Couldn't recognize them, obviously, when you're doing it. You wouldn't have.
At the time, no. So there was the looking back and seeing. I became, in retrospect, I could see that I became more defensive, more brittle, more convinced of my stance and my being, in a sense. I suspect that something in me intuited that this crash was on the horizon. So I think I was becoming more held and more defensive in
So it
response
sounds,
to
yeah.
that. I'm not sure if there's anything that can be done to head it off at the pass entirely. I mean, I really don't know about that.
Yeah, it sounds like if I'm hearing you correctly, there's this kind of false self that you had created that a part of you is trying to protect. And the deeper part of you wouldn't allow it to happen, basically. And says, you have to go through this, Fiona, in order to figure out who you really are.
Yes, absolutely. So at the beginning of it, the language that came to me to describe that was that I'd become really disconnected from my soul, and that this was my soul rebelling against having become that false self. Yeah.
Now, another piece of it is that everybody goes through dark times, you know, and it seems that there is something distinct about this dark night of the soul, which is different than ordinary depression. I wonder if you could maybe speak to that.
Yeah. Just to say, I love the quote that you read out at the beginning. I'd not heard that before, but I think it's really important to make that distinction that when we talk about the dark night of the soul, we're not talking about depression per se. I think that's it. May be that experiencing depression or anxiety or many other things is part of the dark night of the soul, but that's not essentially what characterizes it. So, in my understanding, however difficult and hard the dark night gets, which it absolutely does, we do have a sense or an understanding that this is something deeper and bigger than our small selves, that we are in some way living our own version of the mystical journey. And it does have a sense of some kind of movement or an arc to it, even though there might be periods when we feel really stuck. There is still a sense of an underlying movement and experiences within the whole of the dark night, which show us very clearly that this is a process of unbecoming who we had to become, and a return to ourselves, rather than simply a depression. And I don't mean that in any way to denigrate the experience of depression. I know that can be really difficult and really intense, but this is the dark night is something different. It's a different kind of experience, even though there might obviously be overlap within that.
Now, do you think that there's something inherently spiritual about it? Or I guess another way to ask it is that lots of people consider themselves spiritual on a spiritual path. Do you think there's something part and parcel of being on the spiritual path that one has to go through a phase or a process such as this?
My short answer would be not necessarily. So I think it's quite mysterious in the sense that some people do. This is some people's path, and for some people it doesn't seem to be. Likewise, I think for some people, spiritual practice can open the crack through which the dark night then emerges. People can experience the dark night without thinking of themselves as spiritual. Certainly for me, I'd I'd identified myself as being spiritual in some ways before then, but I didn't have an ongoing spiritual practice, for example. So I think ultimately it's quite mysterious as to who goes through this and who doesn't. I don't think it's necessarily an essential part of the spiritual journey, but for some people it is.
Well, for those of us, I mean, I'll put myself in here also who have gone through it. Uh, what do you think? Well, how did you emerge from it, or what are some of the things you did to not have to experience it anymore, if you don't experience it anymore?
Yes, there's there's lots of angles that come up in response to that question. I think one is that it becomes a path in itself in a way. I mean, we've heard many times this phrase pathless path. I mean, for me, that simply means the ongoing evolution that happens within us that begins in the dark night and continues thereafter. I think it changes as we continue to evolve, because we have greater resources. Things become less intense, I think, because we have more capacity to be with ourselves in those places. So I would say that I did emerge out of it, but it wasn't necessarily by anything that I did. Because I think any movement that we have to try and to not be in it anymore becomes counterproductive. That kind of fighting against it is a bit like, trying to fight our way out of quicksand, in a sense.
So you had to surrender to it in order to emerge from
Yeah,
it.
I think so. And as I say in the book, that surrender doesn't infer passivity. It's not that we have to sort of passively give in, although sometimes that's a part of what happens. The surrender is not without its activity. Because I think as we go through the dark night, we begin to feel our way into what the impetus is in any given moment. Where do I need to go now? What's drawing me now? What's the practice for now? And rather than saying, okay, so here's what you need to do, it's much more a process of feeling into what that means for us in this moment. And in my experience, that's different every time. Certainly, again, in my experience and talking to many other people now who have gone through this, any movement to try and end it or stop it it doesn't work, essentially because that's not the point. The point is not for us to somehow, warrior our way through it. There's an even deeper strength that is honed within the dark night, which is to do with being with what's here rather than trying to not be with what's here.
So I know you talked to a number of people that have undergone this, gone through the dark night. What were some of the common characteristics that people experienced that led to their emergence?
That led to their emergence.
Well, I mean, we could start from what were the common things in their experience, and then we can talk about the common threads in their emergence. Maybe first is just what did they go through that was common to your experience?
Yeah, many things that were common, actually. I mean, each experience of dark night seems to be both beautifully and amazingly unique, and has definite similarities. And I think one of those similarities is in the language that emerges. That the way we talk about it, the way we describe it, is unlike any other kind of writings or descriptions or expressions. And for me, one of the clearest ways that comes across is in poetry. I think it is possible to write about it in prose, but it's definitely not a linear. It's definitely not a linear expression. I was talking to somebody just a couple of hours ago who found herself writing poetry and beginning to write songs when she was in this phase. And obviously for some people, writing isn't their medium. They might find expression in movement or gardening or dancing or any other number of things. In terms of what characterized the emergence, I think it was really an understanding that we were being done. So life, the process itself, God, however we want to describe that, was doing us rather than us somehow being the actors in this. That essentially it's an understanding that it is about being in it and being willing to be in it in all the ways that it manifests, including not being willing to be in it. Are we willing to be with the unwillingness, with the kicking and screaming and fighting, as well as being willing to be with the surrender when those moments of surrender come? So it was beginning to understand that it had its own pace and rhythm,
Mm.
that there wasn't any way of curtailing it or prematurely ending it, that it was a process of one phrase I use in the book is soul ripening. This ripening into to the to the reality of ourselves, the reality of our souls that couldn't be, regardless of whatever our ego selves were feeling about that, was going to take the time it took. And I think there's something about the metaphors like the emergence of a butterfly from the cocoon, or the blossoming of a flower from a bud. We don't expect those things to hurry up. We understand that nature takes the time it takes. And I think for me, that was one of the things that was present in my experience, and also in other people that I spoke to, that when there was a deeper understanding of, oh, okay, this isn't happening to me because there's something wrong with me or because I failed in some way. This is a natural process of evolution,
Mm.
and it will happen in its own time.
It almost sounds like a sort of a sense of being overshadowed, having your ego being overshadowed by your true self, as it were, you know.
Yes, I think that's a beautiful way to put it, that much as our ego might not like that at points, and obviously very often it doesn't like that, even it can't help notice that there's something actually much deeper, much richer, much fuller, and frankly much more important going on.
Well, I guess what I'm wondering is that, well, I'm wondering two things. Let me start with the sort of the small one, then I'll get to sort of the big one. I think an illusion that we all often have is that life is a linear process, that we go through one thing and then the next thing that happens. So you have undergone this process called the dark night of the soul. So does that mean you think that you're never have to go through anything like that again? Is it over, or is there something that, well, we'll just speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I love what you say about that assumption. We live as if things are linear, but in reality we know, of course, they're not, because nothing in nature is linear. As we know, we live in this world of patterns and cycles. So I'd say I will never have to go through that dark night again.
Right.
Shades of it, aspects of it move through still in different ways. So like I was saying, there's this ongoing process of evolution happening, which may include some aspects or shades of what happened before. But because the dark night itself is acting on us, because we are changed by it, we're meeting those things in a sense differently each time, because we're different, because we've been changed by the process. So for example, meeting my grief now is a different experience than meeting my grief 10 years ago.
Sounds like maturation in a certain sense.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it's really, to understand it as a process of maturing, for me, was a really important part of it, and hopefully one that I brought out in the book, because I think it's understanding that what we believed was maturity was really just acting as what we thought a grown up should
Mm.
act, not actually a truer maturity.
Now, I'm reasonably certain that someone might listen to this podcast that's actually undergoing some process like this.
Yeah.
And as someone who has gone about this process, gone through this process and thought about it and talked to other people about it, what advice would you give to somebody that's undergoing a dark night of the soul?
It's interesting, the the word advice, because that immediately makes me cautious. Um, there are things that I would like to say, but I don't know that any of them fall under the category of
Well,
advice.
let's just
Yeah.
change the
Oh.
word.
One of the things I'd say, and really the biggest thing I'd say, is you're not on your own. You know, this is something that many of us go through, that many of us have gone through. You know, as you read initially, you know, the Dark Night of the Soul phrase came from a 16th, 17th century poet. You know, this is the mystical journey that people have undergone for many, many centuries and are still undergoing. So this isn't happening because of some fault in you. It's happening because this is the archetypal mystical journey that we experience all in our own personal, ordinary, everyday ways. You know, this doesn't make us somehow special people who can claim something. It just makes us, you know, another example of humanity and another example of somebody else who has gone through this. I think the other thing I'd say is just be with yourself as best you can. You know, it's very natural in this place to try and grab hold of something, to try and grab hold of a solution or something to fix you. And I'm not saying to stop doing that at all, because I think there can be valuable things that come out of that process. But fundamentally, I think this is a process of learning how to be present with ourselves. And very simply, that means us, being with ourselves. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. So our tendency is, particularly when we're in a lot of pain, when we're terrified, is to reach outwards, to imagine that the solution will be complicated, because what is happening within us feels so complex and so entangled and difficult. But in my experience, it's actually coming back to greater and greater simplicity over time.
That's interesting. It calls up, I guess, another question, which is that in a state like this, it's a very individual and being with yourself process. At the same time, it seems like there's a danger of being too isolated with it. Yeah, so I'm just wondering about that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's basically the reason I wrote the book, is because when I was going through the Dark Night of the Soul, I felt incredibly isolated in it. There was nobody else who lived around me who had any notion of what was going on. Understandably enough, but obviously that was difficult for me. And I think one of the biggest things that we can do, and in fact one of the things I offer, is a monthly gathering for anybody that wants to join the gathering, because I think there's something very powerful about communing with each other and about coming together in communion. And I mean that in the simplest possible way, you know, being together without teachings, without techniques, without tools, just simply being present with each other exactly as we are, and meeting each other in that place.
That's wonderful. I will, I'll post something in the show notes to enable people to get in touch with you if they want to experience that. Is that like a face-to-face thing, or it's an online thing, or?
Yeah, it's an online thing.
Okay, great.
So
Yeah.
anybody from anywhere can come.
All right. I just want to pivot briefly to telling people a little bit about the Diversity and Spirituality Network. The simplest way to learn more about it, go on our website, diversityandspirituality.com. We also have an active Facebook group, which you could find on Facebook. And on the third Saturday every month, we have an online gathering that Fiona is actually going to facilitate one for us. And you can find more about us by going to the website. And just want to just give a little plug to Fiona's book. It looks like backwards from here, but it's called The Dark Night of the Soul. You can find it on Amazon. And she's also a gifted healer. And if you feel called to, please reach out to her. Fiona, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. And delighted to get to know you a little bit better and to join you on this journey that we're on.
Thank you, Angelo. It's been a real pleasure.